They called him Guts. When I decided to go into the ministry, I prepared for it at Harvard Divinity School. I chose that school because it had certain links to the history of Unitarianism and Transcendentalism. This morning I want to tell you about a connection I just discovered. My undergraduate education and my law school education had both occurred in the 1960s and 70s when student activism was a common thing on campus. I was used to attending demonstrations on public land or university campuses. By contrast, the campuses seemed rather quiet in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I had left divinity school and started my ministry career and could probably count on one hand the numbers of public demonstrations I have been to since my ordination. I have kept up a cordial relationship with my alma mater over the years, but did not feel strongly about it. For example, I've never been to a Harvard football game or any other sporting event. If it were the Harvard-Yale game, I would not know which side to root for because I also have my undergraduate degree from Harvard's arch rival. So when the Trump administration started harassing elite colleges, and particularly when they got Columbia University to fold at their first demand, I was sickened and very anxious. I have a strong belief in the worth of liberal arts education. I believe that it is part of the endowment of Western culture from the Enlightenment, and that truth is derived from the clash of ideas. The Trump administration's assault on universities could really do lasting damage to our culture. Last year, I had been appalled at the way the Republicans in Congress maneuvered Harvard's former president, Claudine Gray, into resigning. I didn't know much about her successor, Alan Garber, who took over as interim president and now has assumed the title of president. Garber made some initial moves which seemed like he was going to give in to some demands from the new administration. I was greatly dispirited to hear that. But then came the headline that Harvard had rejected most of the Trump administration's demands and that within a few days it had sued the Trump administration. Moreover, Harvard's stance seemed to have broken a logjam among American universities, which quickly lined up behind Harvard to oppose the administration's assault. So it was with soaring spirit that I drank in the headlines around this turnaround. And at the end of one of the stories, I found a reference to a particular physical object that links this congregation to this large frame playing out on the international stage, the national stage. I will get to that later in this talk, but it concerns the Reverend Edward Holyoke. Holyoke, who founded the church we meet in today, was a big man in more ways than one. He had a lot of girth, which is why some students of his at Harvard hung the nickname Guts on him. He also had more than his share of courage and integrity, a more modern meaning of the word guts, which is why I want to devote this sermon to him and shout out to his Harvard successor, Alan Garber, who has displayed his own version of guts in staring down the know-nothing axe wielders of the present national administration. Edward Holyoke was born June 26, 1689, the son of a wealthy businessman, Elizur Holyoke Jr., and Mary Elliott, and the grandson of Elizur Holyoke Sr. of Springfield, Massachusetts. It was this grandfather of the minister who gave his name to the town of Holyoke, Massachusetts, and to Mount Holyoke, on whose flanks Mount Holyoke College would be built. Reverend Holyoke grew up in the North End of Boston, along with his friend John Barnard. According to Michael Gary's book, both graduated from Harvard College, Holyoke at age 16. At his commencement ceremony, Holyoke was asked to deliver an oration, even though he was said to have garnered more fines and demerits than any student of his day. He remained in residence and went on to receive his master's degree from the college in 1708, was librarian for the next 3 years, elected a tutor of the college in 1712, and not long after, a fellow of the corporation. He was especially interested in natural philosophy, what we now call science, and mathematics, gathering statistics on the weather and observing eclipses from the turret of the Boston townhouse using astronomical equipment imported from England. He was in charge of teaching mathematics to all the seniors, clearly a rising star. He was esteemed as a scholar and gentleman, eventually turning to the ministry as a permanent vocation. His older friend, John Barnard, also turned to the same profession. Neither Holyoke nor Barnard had much to do with the coastal town of Marblehead before the occasion when both were rivals for a pulpit here. John Barnard years later gave this description of Marblehead in 1714, just before this rivalry developed. Quote, "There was not so much as one proper carpenter, nor mason, nor tailor, nor butcher in the town, nor any market worth naming, but they had their houses built by country workmen, and their clothes made out of town, and supplied themselves with beef and pork from Boston, which drained the town of its money. The people contented themselves to be slaves that digged in the mines and left the merchants of Boston, Salem, and Europe to carry away the gains, but which means the town was always dismally poor, and circumstances involved in debt to the merchants more than they were worth, nor could I find 20 families in it that upon the best examination could stand upon their own legs. And they were generally as rude, swearing, drunken, and fighting a crew as they were poor," end quote. A minister named John Cheever had been minister of the First Church in Marblehead, which we now know as Old North Church, for several decades. He had invited Cotton Mather, the famous strict Puritan, as a guest in his pulpit, and Mather became concerned during his visit about a successor to Mr. Cheever, who was quite elderly. He suggested they set up a selection process. 3 candidates survived the initial shakeup, and they were Mr. Cheever's son, Barnard, and Holyoke. In the second round of voting, young Cheever dropped out, and Barnard had a substantial edge. The town certified the results of the voting, but Barnard did not want to agree to take it when the populace was divided. Church historian Michael Geary describes the situation after the first votes. Quote, "Holyoke's adherents were not pleased with the outcome. Many at the time of the vote had not yet become church members and could not participate in the voting. Controversy arose within the congregation, and Barnard became discouraged. Accepting a ministry in a divided congregation was then, as it is now, a situation to be avoided. And he delayed his decision for some months. First Church representatives were eventually compelled to travel to Boston to see Barnard's thoughts directly. In his autobiographical essay, Barnard indicated that he inquired of them if a second house of worship might not be built for Holyoke and his supporters. The ambassador of the First Church agreed that if it could be done peaceably, they had nothing against it. He then asked if they could reconvene in the evening with Holyoke and some of his supporters at Holyoke's father's house. Continuing the quotation from Gary's book, a compromise was reached. Barnard replied to the First Church representatives, "Gentlemen, if you can amicably agree, then Mr. Holyoke shall settle amongst his friends. I will accept the offer of the church to settle with them. Otherwise, I know not how to comply with your request, for I do not care to fix in a town under the disadvantage of strife and contention." Now, isn't that beautiful? One of the nicest little ways of working out through that arrangement I've ever heard of. Holyoke supported the compromise by stating, "If Mr. Barnard will go to Marblehead, I will go also, else not." They presently fell into an agreement to build a new house for Mr. Holyoke, and his friends promised to use their influence with the town to consent to it, and so they parted good friends. Now, there were many more complications. At a certain point, the leaders at Old North considered merging with St. Michael's Anglican Church, but John Barnard responded to that prospect by reaffirming his compromise. It was going to be 2 congregational churches, or he would not come to Marblehead. That is how we came to have a 2nd congregational church in Marblehead. The building was nearly constructed, yet there was one more point of tension between the 2 congregations. The 2nd church set the date for ordination of Edward Holyoke in such a manner that he would be the 2nd person ordained to the congregational ministry after Mr. Cheever. First church members were upset because it seemed to them that Mr. Barnard should be ordained before Mr. Holyoke. The day for the ceremony arrived, and many clergymen came from neighboring towns. They therefore constituted a conference. However, the members of First Church, perceiving a slight, refused to release the members of First Church from their ties to that church. So the council called for the ordination, exercising a power that it had under the Puritan Constitution, granted those parishioners dismission, thus enabling the ordination to proceed. Mr. Gary summed up 3 Marblehead churches as follows. During the course of events leading to the formation of 2nd Church, all 3 Marblehead congregations felt maltreated by the actions of one or both of the others. 2nd Church was at least guilty in indelicacy during its endeavor, and First Church displayed considerable intransigence. The resulting congregational wounds would take the passing of a generation to completely heal. But very soon, the 2 congregational societies began to work in concert. Reconciliation was hastened because Marblehead acquired 2 ministers of remarkable character and ability both. Both understood the responsibilities associated with their elevated station in the town and province, and maintained a strong personal connection with the leaders of Massachusetts. For the genuine personal respect that Parsons, Barnard, and Holyoke exhibited for one another transcends the events of the separation, influenced the town for decades, and was carried forward by later ministers at both congregations. In the way he ran the church, Mr. Holyoke quickly acquired the reputation of a liberal. Many Puritan churches at this time were tied in knots about the formula for being religiously qualified to be a church member. Originally, there was something called the covenant, whereby everyone seeking to join a church had to provide evidence that they had witnessed an appearance of Jesus Christ. And in those days, you did not lie about something like that. After a while, the church found there were not enough people qualifying to be members, and so they relaxed the requirement of a direct personal appearance and formed the halfway covenant, which allowed a person to join a church if their parents had met the qualifications for that church. Church member Christopher Green, I knew his parents in Staten Island, writes, one of the hallmarks of Holyoke's 21-year ministry in Marblehead was his liberal attitude toward church membership in an era when most churches had severe tests for becoming communicants. The Puritans had admitted into church membership none but saints. He described his expansive eligibility policy in his journal. Any person desiring to come into full communion with the church, having stood propounded to the deacons for 1 week, and no objection occurring to our pastor, and he is satisfied with their fitness for that relation, they shall be received. Mr. Green further notes, those received into membership included women and African American servants. Church records also show that Mr. Holyoke performed several marriages of African American church members. I'm sure that word servants is a euphemism for slaves. In 1736, while Holyoke was still minister of this church, he was asked to preach to the opening session of the colonial legislature. The sermon was printed and copies of it survive, which provide a good insight into the mind of this minister. He entitled the sermon, quote, "Integrity and religion to be principally regarded by such as design or assign others to stations of public trust," unquote. Christopher Green helpfully translates this title into modern idiom as guidelines for selecting political appointees. Ironically, integrity and religious dedication are precisely what is missing in the appointees of the current administration. Christopher Green says, warming to his subject, what kind of persons these legislators should appoint to positions of public trust, Holyoke makes a quite extraordinary argument. First, he cites a text from the New Testament, which generations of Calvinists had used to justify church control of government. The words are ascribed to St. Paul, quote, there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained by God, 13 Romans. But Holyoke hastens to add that he is not saying that public officials can discharge their duty by simply doing nothing. Quote, I mean not by these texts at all to recommend the senseless doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance, a doctrine calculated for none but a nation of slaves. These texts have so far been abused to that purpose, unquote. And he continues, quote, all forms of government originate from the people. That is, God in his providence has influenced the people some to fix upon one form of government and some upon another. As these forms then have originated from the people, doubtless they may be changed whatsoever the body of the people choose to make such an alteration in their state, unquote. What does this sound like? It sounds to me like the doctrine of popular sovereignty, the idea that all power proceeds from the people. And this sermon was preached 40 years before the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Gary comments on this passage, quote, the concept that government originated from the consent of the governed was not novel in 1736. It had been proposed by Enlightenment philosopher John Locke on Two Treatises of Government, 1689, and others half a century earlier. However, Locke's writing was not printed in the colonies until 1773. Hence, Holyoke's concise declaration, especially as it was to the king's appointed governor and the general court 40 years before the Declaration of Independence, was both courageous and revolutionary. It is no coincidence that almost without exception, the Massachusetts revolutionary leaders of 1775 studied under Holyoke at Harvard. Christopher Green sums up the address thusly: the bulk of this sermon is a logical argument for why only men of integrity and what he called true religion should be considered for public appointments, end quote. Would that he were around today. 1 year after Edward Holyoke preached his sermon, he was named president of Harvard College. His career there, as Christopher Green notes, was long and eventful. He stepped up the pace of educational reform. Reading lists were overhauled. Tutors were assigned to instruct individual specialties instead of attaching themselves to an entire class for 4 years. Public debates were instituted. He established the country's first physics lab. He also abolished corporal punishment. He led Harvard's opposition to the fundamentalist religious fervor of the 1740s called the Great Awakening. And he was popular with the students who called him Guts, supposedly because he had such a big one. He was first minister of this church, and his ministry lasted 21 years. In 1737, he resigned his pastorate in order to become the 9th president of Harvard College, a position he held from September 28, 1737, until his death, June 1st, 1769, the second longest presidency in Harvard's history. Mr. Gary sums up his chapters on Holyoke thus: when the debate over independence from Great Britain intensified, and Massachusetts leaders became prominent in what became the War of Independence, it is not a coincidence that almost every one of the patriots had been educated at Harvard under President Holyoke. These included John Adams, Samuel Adams, Thomas Cushing, Eldridge Gerry, John Hancock, Jonathan Mayhew, James Otis, Josiah Quincy Jr., Artemus Ward, and Joseph Warren. Benjamin Franklin was even awarded an honorary degree in 1753. So with all that history and political philosophy, what is the physical connection between Holyoke's presidency of Harvard and Alan Garber's? Just this chair. Do we have a picture of it? Okay. Just this chair. This chair was chosen by Mr. Holyoke for the office of Harvard president, and it is still in use today. According to one source, Holyoke turned the spindles on the rear of the chair himself. The Boston Globe said this recently in describing Garber's emergence in the current crisis. In his characteristic way, Garber, 69, himself has dropped a few understated quips that offer insight into Harvard's situation and his own. Ever the analytical academic, the former provost at the university said, quote, an excessive aversion to risk is a risk itself. An excessive aversion to risk is a risk itself. I like that. His induction ceremony as Harvard president also spoke to the circumstances in several ways. It was conducted practically in secret in December, nearly a year after he began leading the school, and just after Trump had been elected and was already laying plans for his own crackdown on universities. Of his occupying the Holyoke chair, a 450-year-old ceremonial wooden seat for Harvard's president, Garber observed that it was, quote, not as uncomfortable as I expected it to be, but it was surprisingly warm when I sat on it during commencement. It seems to be growing hotter by the day. So Dr. Garber, you're sitting in Reverend Holyoke's chair. May it give you the wisdom, the courage, and the guts to preserve our values against the present assault. Best wishes from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Marblehead. May the enlightenment light our way into the future, and be careful getting in or out of that chair. Amen.